From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We're going to start out today with a check on the markets. Joining us is Kayleigh Lyon. So, Kayleigh, I think we had sort of a high during the week with the inauguration and talk about stimulus. It seems like we're coming off of that just a little bit at the end of the week.
Just a little bit. It definitely was a solidly risk-off tone to start this Friday session, David. We are starting to see that improve as the session grows older, maybe a little bit of dip buying coming in, but we are still off record highs on all of the major averages. This is a market that is contending with what could be a very difficult road forward for President Biden's $1.9 trillion stimulus package that it really has been counting on, plus worsening virus headlines all across the world with the possibility of lockdowns getting extended in Europe. That said, we are off the lows of the session, the exception, though, being the SOX index, that one that tracks semiconductors. It's still lower by about 1.3%. Intel, the big reason why that stock is down about 8% after reporting earnings after the bell last night. And speaking of earnings, David, we know with the inauguration, everything that has happened over the course of this week, we also had some bank earnings that have been rolling out. It is still earnings season, and a number of those big banks are lower on the week. Citi, Goldman, Bank of America, JP Morgan, all down between 3 and 5%. Profits were good. The results really aren't that bad, but they had seen such a run up into those reports that they really just weren't getting rewarded by the market. And as we head into next week, David, the biggest week of earnings season, including 4 of the 5 largest cap stocks in the S&P 500. That would be Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, and Tesla. We'll have to see if they can rise to the challenge or if earnings season may actually turn out to be a bit of a downside catalyst here, David.
Kayleigh, is there any indication out there that investors might be getting a little nervous? You've seen some of the people now starting to talk about bubble. Maybe it's gone too far too fast. And I see on the 200 daily moving average, we're above it on both the Russell and also on the tech.
Well, yeah, the Russell 2000 has been for some time the most overextended relative to that 200-day moving average on record. So there has been a lot of heat in this kind of reflation cyclical trade. And you're seeing, David, in the earnings season in particular, a lot of those value plays, their quarterly reports just really aren't standing up. They're not giving the positive outlooks that the market had to a large extent priced in. As we know, this market is a discount mechanism. It is forward looking. It's looking toward a better future. But what you're hearing out of a lot of companies like United Airlines yesterday, they don't really know when the future is actually going to be better. They can't pinpoint when all of this virus uncertainty is going to go away. So I think you're seeing the market recognize that a touch, that maybe that recovery we're all expecting in the back half, maybe a little bit further out than some would like.
Okay, thank you so much to Kayleigh Lyon for that report on the market. So let's turn now from Wall Street to Pennsylvania Avenue. President Biden has issued a flurry of executive orders in his first 3 days in office, raising questions of both policy and politics. To take us through them, we welcome now Lanhee Chen, Hoover Institution Fellow and Director of Domestic Policy Studies at Stanford University. Mr. Chen served as Policy Director for Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign for president. Lanhee, always great to have you with us. So we had another set of executive orders today dealing with a minimum wage for federal contract employees, also with food stamps. Give us your sense of what the strategy here is for the Biden administration.
Well, I think there's 2 things, David. First of all, it's an effort to restore some of the Obama administration policies. For example, the minimum wage hike for federal contractors and employees. That's something that we saw during the Obama administration as well. The second thing is really about showing that the new president is taking action. And we have seen this increasingly over the last couple of presidencies. Presidents want to demonstrate that they're actually doing something. They want to demonstrate that they're responsive to their campaign promises. So increasingly, we're seeing the use of executive action, which obviously is troubling, whether it's done by a Democrat or a Republican, because it does circumvent the traditional role of Congress, which is to make law, and for the executive, the president, to execute laws. Executive orders and executive action can interfere with that design. But we are seeing presidents do it more often because it shows that they're taking action and gives them some political benefit at a very early point in the administration.
And the party that's out of power always complains about it, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, when the other one's doing it. But give me this sense, because you understand this so well, Lanhee. The president has to get some things out of Congress, particularly that some form of stimulus. He's asking for $1.9 trillion, whether it's that number or another number. Does going ahead with a lot of executive orders make that harder or easier, or is it irrelevant?
I don't see the two as being directly connected. I think Republicans in Congress fully expected Joe Biden to use the power available to him via executive action to circumvent the Congress in some cases, to enact the policies he wanted to enact. I think the bigger question going forward on the stimulus discussion, David, is going to be, will the Democrats and Biden be willing to break up that $1.9 trillion package to focus in on areas where there is bipartisan support? More money for vaccines, more money for COVID testing, more money for healthcare and PPE, potentially enhanced payments to individuals. There seems to be some bipartisan agreement there. There's a lot less bipartisan agreement on the size of the package as well as the scope of the entire package.
Lanhee, as you said, there's a lot of agreement on we've got to do something with this virus. We're in a crisis situation, continue to be in a crisis situation. Let's talk about that. What do you make of the extensive plans, I think it's fair to say, that we saw out of the Biden administration yesterday for vaccination?
Well, I think the challenge here is obviously there's a messaging issue and then there's a substance. The messaging that you're seeing from the Biden administration is obviously we've got to get the pace up. We've got to vaccinate more people per day. I think that is a right message. I think that is the right goal to set, even if it's not overly ambitious in terms of the president's desire to vaccinate 100 million over the first 100 days. I do think, though, the bigger question is, what is the federal government going to do to actually change things? Can it actually do anything? Because the last mile of this vaccine distribution effort has been left to the states and in some cases to local health authorities, and that's produced some pretty inconsistent results. Smaller states like West Virginia have done very well. Bigger states like where I live in California have done very poorly. And so it is going to be up to the federal government now. We'll see if the strategy really changes. Is the federal government going to be more assertive? Can it be more assertive in, for example, ramping up production to ensure there's ample supply for everyone who wants to get vaccinated? That has been a concern where I think the federal government can help and can step in.
There's the production side, and the Biden administration says they're going to invoke the Defense Production Act to try to make sure we have the elements that go into the vaccine to make sure we're making enough. There's also, as you say, the distribution issue. They said they're going to open various facilities across the country, both mobile and fixed, for vaccination. Can they open enough of them to make a difference soon enough?
Well, it depends on what it means to make a difference. I mean, if you believe Dr. Fauci, what he said yesterday is we need to be closer to 2 to 3 million shots a day versus 1 million shots a day. I mean, that's a huge difference, right? And so you're going to need a lot more places for the vaccine to be distributed. It's great to open more places one can get a vaccine. I think that's a great idea. The challenge is really going to come down to, is there going to be enough supply of the two formulations that are approved now, the Pfizer one and the Moderna one? Is there going to be enough supply? You know, part of this also is we're waiting to see if another formulation will come online. Johnson & Johnson has a promising formulation that just requires one shot, but that still may be weeks or months away. So some of this is really about, is ample supply going to be available? Because you can have all the sites you want, but if those sites don't have enough vaccine, it's a relatively moot point.
So a sensitive subject in some corners, and that is what we do between now and then. That is to say, social distancing, mask wearing. We have the President of the United States, Joe Biden, now saying everybody's got to wear a mask. We see the numbers continue to climb. Yesterday, he said we could lose another 100,000 people in the next month. Can we change that curve at all while we're waiting for the vaccines to kick in?
Well, you know, I think it's the same message that's been sent since the beginning. I mean, I think it's important for all of these things, mask wearing, social distancing. The fact that we're hearing it now from the White House, from the Oval Office is incredibly important. That message needs to continue. I just think, David, there's a lot of fatigue out there. And we saw that fatigue during the holiday period, Christmas and New Year's. We saw spikes in many states as a result. And I think that was a function of fatigue. And going forward, that's not going to get any easier. So the vaccine piece of this is really going to be crucial. I think that is going to be how we defeat this virus in the coming months. And really ensuring that that supply gets out there is going to be absolutely critical, because there's only so much more messaging that can be done on the mask wearing and on the distancing. I think at some point people just get tired of it.
Okay, Lanhee, thank you so much. As I say, it's always good to talk with Lanhee Chen of the Hoover Institution. Coming up, we talk with the former head of Hewlett Packard, Fiorina, about what we're learning about President Biden as a leader. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. New Senate Majority Leader, New York Democrat Chuck Schumer, says House Speaker Nancy Pelosi intends to send the article of impeachment against former President Trump to the Senate on Monday, saying, quote, there will be a trial.
We have three essential items on our plate. One, the confirmation of President Biden's cabinet and other key officials. 2, legislation to provide desperately needed COVID relief. 3, a second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. The Senate must and will do all 3.
Mr. Trump is the first U.S. president to be impeached twice and the first to face a trial after leaving office. President Biden isn't wasting time rolling out relief to millions of Americans affected by the pandemic, taking executive action today to provide a stopgap while Congress begins to consider his $1.9 trillion package. The 2 executive orders increase food aid, protect job seekers on unemployment, and provide a clear path for federal workers and contractors to get a $15 an hour minimum wage. The president's pick for Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has seen her nomination advanced. The Senate Finance Committee approved the vote 26-0. It will now receive a full vote on the Senate floor. Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, says the body must continue to confirm Mr. Biden's team. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. President Biden set a different tone for his leadership at the inauguration on Wednesday, saying he would do everything that he could to bring the country together, even as he recognized that there are real differences that do divide us. Welcome now the former head of Hewlett Packard, Fiorina, who herself ran for president in 2016 against Donald Trump. Ms. Fiorina is the founder and chairman of Fiorina Enterprises and Unlocking Potential. Always a pleasure, a privilege to have you with us, Carly. So I want to ask you, as a former chief executive of a company, not a country, but what do you make of President Biden in the first days, recognizing he has never run anything, I don't think, besides a Senate office? Does that put him at a disadvantage in trying to manage 4 million people who are his employees now?
Well, I think it's always great to be with you, David. Thank you for having me. I think Biden, like any good leader, needs to know their strengths and needs to know where they need help. And to the point of never having run anything, I think what we're seeing Biden do is roll out staff that are highly experienced. And I think that's a good thing. One of the reasons that I endorsed Joe Biden way back in June was because of his humility and his empathy. Humility and empathy are valued qualities so often, but they are vital qualities for a leader, particularly a leader in crisis, which he clearly faces, because humility and empathy are required for collaboration, and collaboration is required in crisis. But that same quality of humility, I think, allows Joe Biden to understand he needs a lot of help. And so the fact that he swore in literally 1,000+ highly experienced and competent staff members on his first day, I hope speaks to his recognition that he's going to need help.
Yeah, and interesting, in that swearing in, he said to them, do not treat one another with disrespect. If I find out any of you do that, you will be fired. I mean, he's delivered a very strong message. At the same time, there's a step from the talk and the walk. As you say, we are in crisis. We have a pandemic. We've got an economic crisis. Racial justice is a very much pressing issue. Inequality is an issue. How does he go from saying, let's all work together, to actually getting people to do things together, including Republicans, of which you are one?
Yes. Well, of course, that's the art of sausage making. Look, I do believe that his call for unity was the right place to start. Yes, cynics can say it's only words, but on the other hand, it's a word we haven't heard and haven't talked about and focused on for quite a long time, actually before Donald Trump. And so starting by saying unity is our most pressing imperative now, I think not only is correct, but I think he needed to call it out and be explicit. Secondly, I mentioned collaboration. You can't collaborate with others without respect, without valuing other people's opinion, but without humility and empathy. But finally, I would say, if there's one president who has the experience of collaborating and sausage making up on Capitol Hill, it's Joe Biden. And so maybe it's one of the reasons that this is a time we need a professional Paul who's been around the track many, many, many times with members of both parties, because he's going to need to put those skills in place.
As a Republican, albeit one that did endorse Joe Biden for president, is there something that they could propose that would be a clear signal to Republicans that it's not going to be all our way? This is something that's been really important to you Republicans over the years. We've never done it for you. Let's include this in the package.
You know, I think it's a great point. And I do think, you know, your previous guest made the comment that perhaps Biden would be willing to take apart this $1.9 trillion package. I think it would be smart to signal that they're willing to do that, not to give up on $1.9 trillion, but to say, let's start with where we can agree. And as we agree, let's enact, let's move, let's get this money to people. So if we can agree on more vaccines, good. If we can agree on money to open schools, good. If we can agree on some additional spending for individuals, good. In other words, don't force people to say it's all or nothing. Let's move through our areas of agreement. By the way, that's how you would do it in a business.
Yeah. Exactly right. Isn't that the truth? So, Carly, let's turn to an area you know terribly well, which is technology. We've just had a president of the United States in Donald Trump who used social media very effectively. You can like it, you can dislike it, but boy, it was effective without a doubt. How was Joe Biden use social media? Because it doesn't strike me that he can just disregard it. At the same time, he clearly doesn't want to do what President Trump did. You heard a lot in his speech about the difference between truth and falsehood.
Yes, you know, I think, first of all, obviously Donald Trump was very effective at it. Secondly, there's, of course, a whole priority issue around how are these social media companies held to account? What do we do with the power they hold? What rules of the road should people agree on? That is an area of bipartisan interest and support that Biden could perhaps prioritize. But to your specific question, my guess, although I have no insight, my guess is that President Biden should use the POTUS handle to communicate officially. You know, President Trump sort of changed the norm, and President Trump was talking about his emotions, his feelings. He was attacking people personally. It was effective in getting him attention. It was also extremely effective in dividing the nation. And so I think Biden should use it frequently, but he should use it to amplify the official messages that he is delivering through more traditional channels, such as speeches or position papers or from the press room.
Finally, Carly, one more tool at a leader's disposal, and that is symbols. I think we saw a lot of symbolism on Wednesday during that inauguration and afterwards, the speech at the Lincoln Memorial. As a leader, as you were at Hewlett Packard, how do you use symbolism? How do you think about symbolism in order to convey a substantive message to your troops as they are?
Well, I do think symbols are extremely important. And I also think that when you are undertaking huge change, a leader needs to think about what will stay the same. My motto is preserve the best and reinvent the rest. So I do think that Joe Biden needs to send a signal about what he wants to keep the same. And I also think he needs to have a visible moment where he is working with Republicans, personally working with Republicans on some issue. And perhaps he can combine the two. Perhaps he can sit down with Republicans and say, you know, you did this, or you like this, or you believe in this, and we're going to keep it because it helps us change other things where we also can come to agreement.
Carly, great to have you with us, as always. Really appreciate it. That's former Hewlett Packard CEO Carly Fiorina. And a programming note now, Wall Street Week airs tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have Larry Summers, Glenn Hubbard, and Liz Saunders among our guests. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're awaiting a White House briefing on the U.S. economy that will include Press Secretary Jen Psaki, as well as the new National Economic Council Director, Brian Deese. To help us set the stage, welcome now Michael McKee, Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent. So I would say this president's off to a pretty fast start with his executive orders. What are you expecting to hear about the economy? This is what's slated for today and their first 10 days.
Well, looking at the audience, I suspect that Brian Deese is going to try to explain the need for the various components of the president's $1.9 trillion package. The problem that they have is that the moderates up on Capitol Hill don't, at the moment, see the need to do it. They don't understand why, after passing a $900 billion proposal, they need to add more stimulus to the economy. Now, Deese and the president would argue this is not stimulus. This is a rescue package, a safety net to keep people going until they can get to the point where they can stimulate the economy once it reopens again. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. And of course, they're talking to the White House press corps, who are not economists. And if they can get them to understand it, maybe that will help with the folks on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, the folks on Capitol Hill, and also perhaps going over their heads. You've covered Washington for so many years, Mike. How much of this is we're going to try to, as best we can, reach the American people directly so they can talk to the representatives and say, we do need the help. And if that's the goal, who are those people and what do you pitch to them?
Yeah. Well, I think at this point, that's the goal. The question is, how do they get it there, and how much sense of urgency can they provide? I mean, some of this stuff is fairly easy. If you want to sell $1,400 checks to people, they're going to say yes. But the Republicans who don't like the idea of money for states and cities, they're going to take more convincing. And so it's going to be a real sales effort. And I think one of the things you'll probably see in this briefing is, given the White House press corps, an emphasis on the politics more than the economics. Questions about how they are going to get this passed. Deese is going to meet with 16 bipartisan senators over the weekend to try to sell them on this, particularly the Republicans. And it looks like, from the headlines we've had this morning, that Chuck Schumer is starting to take a hard line against the Republicans and Mitch McConnell. So the question is, how much do they, as Carly Fiorina just said, want to be seen as working with Republicans, and how much do they want to just push it through using what Nancy Pelosi said would be a reconciliation process in a couple of weeks?
The more things change, the more they stay the same in Washington sometimes. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Coming up, we're going to be bringing you that press briefing when it occurs with Brian Deese, the new head of the National Economic Council. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. As we wait for that press briefing from the White House, we want to turn to the question of foreign policy. In his inauguration address, President Biden set a goal for himself of rebuilding alliances, as he put it, something that did not always appear at the top of President Trump's agenda. But that doesn't mean that the Biden administration will seek to change all of what the Trump administration did in foreign affairs. And to help us sort through the differences and the continuities, welcome now Ian Bremmer. He is president of Eurasia Group and of G0 Media. So great to have you back with us, Ian. So if he's been dealt a set of cards here in foreign policy by the Trump administration, which ones does he hold on to first before we get to the discard pile?
Oh, sure. It's pretty easy. You look at some things that Biden recognizes are successes. Big thing to hold on to, China policy. The fact that the Trump administration recognized that we have big challenges on a lot of fronts with China, and we have to lean into them, particularly on technology, on data, 5G. Our companies don't have access to the Chinese data market. It's the largest in the world. And we have real national security concerns when Chinese companies are involved. That has to involve not just the U.S., but also other democracies around the world. Trump got that started. Biden should continue it. Geopolitics in the Middle East, the Abraham Accords, normalizing relations between Israel, by far our most important ally in the region, and other countries that we get on with, like Morocco and UAE and Bahrain, and eventually Saudi Arabia, too. That's something that Biden has supported. Trump got it done. Biden should continue it. I also think efforts to reduce U.S. troops around the world in active combat missions. I mean, the war in Afghanistan does need to end. U.S. presence in Iraq and Syria should end. And a plan for that, I mean, Trump didn't have much of a plan. He did have an impulse. I think Biden should take that impulse and make a plan, but we should continue to draw that down. I think the interest in the United States continuing to fight forever wars is indeed a low one, and we need to focus much more on Asia than we do on the Middle East. That would be a few that I would throw out just to begin with.
Well, let's go back over a couple of them and start with the first one you had with China and technology. That's something, Ian, you were on at the very beginning. You have emphasized that very consistently. Do you think with all that the Trump administration did China budge on that at all? Did we make any progress?
We made a lot of progress in terms of starting to create alternatives. We made a lot of progress in the sense that Trump, as a unilateralist, still has now a whole bunch of American allies that are saying, yeah, we need to work with the Americans together on 5G and on data, and we're concerned about China. We have a much better capacity to create a workable alternative that will be stronger and ultimately will reflect more of the global economy. But in terms of the impact on China, the danger of saying we don't want this Chinese system is that the Chinese do understand that they need to defend their own supply chain. They need to defend their own national champions. And I think the efforts taken against Jack Ma and Ant Financial are in part because of who Jack is and his level of independence from the Chinese leadership, but in part a reaction to the vulnerability that China has to the U.S. and its allies in this space. I think that when they talk about a dual circulation policy as part of the upcoming 5-year plan, some of which is focused on Chinese consumption increases, but some of which is focusing on greater autarkic control of key strategic industries, that's a response to the Chinese government saying we never want to be so vulnerable in the way that ZTE and Huawei were to the Trump administration. So this is a tough one, but we need to address it. Avoiding it wasn't going to make it better.
To borrow a term from the Cold War, and I'm not suggesting this is a Cold War at all, but to borrow a term, is the basic strategy a containment strategy rather than a modify their behavior strategy?
We're not in a Cold War, you're right. And that's because no matter where technology goes, there's still an immense amount of economic interdependence between the U.S. and China that will still be there going forward. And we abrogate that at our mutual peril. But when it comes to technology, we want to win. I think the way you should think about it, David, from an economic perspective, is the last 50 years, China's growth has basically been on the back of incredible amounts of relatively inexpensive, quite productive labor. And not only has that driven Chinese growth, but we, the United States and our allies, have facilitated that. We've moved a lot of our labor from our own countries to China, even knowing that that was going to increase displacement of our own labor forces. We facilitated China's growth with that model because we thought that long-term it was better for us. Now, increasingly, China's growth model is not about labor. Their labor is more expensive. We don't need as much of it. It's a more competitive environment. Increasingly, China's competitive model is switching to data. And China is the largest data market in the world by a long margin. But unlike labor, we, the United States, do not believe that we should facilitate China's dominance of the data market. In fact, we think China's dominance of the data market is dangerous to us, both economically and from a national security perspective. And I think that's probably right. And so that means that we have to address it. And the best ways to address it is to have a policy, to have a strategy, to get our allies aligned with this. You know, I mean, no matter how much you don't like China's strategy, you can't beat something with nothing. You got to beat something with something. And I do think that the Trump administration began to put something on the table when it comes to dealing with Chinese technology. And I fully expect the Biden administration will pick up where that left off.
So, Ian, let's turn, if we can, from Asia to the Middle East. You mentioned the Abraham Accords and the fact that that was an accomplishment for the Trump administration, that you'd want to preserve and extend, if possible, the normalization of relations between Israel and some of the Arab countries. At the same time, to what extent was that facilitated by a very close relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and perhaps even personal to President Trump and his son-in-law? And will that be continuing going forward? How will our relationship with Saudi Arabia change? How should it change?
Well, let's keep in mind, David, that Saudi Arabia is not a signatory of the Abraham Accords. They tried. Trump tried. Jared tried personally very hard. And Jared and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, text each other all the time. Couldn't quite get it over the goal line, in part because the king of Saudi Arabia doesn't support it. The country's still pretty conservative, though they are moving in that direction. The relationship of the U.S. with the UAE, for example, is very strong under Trump. It was very strong under Obama, too. It was just a lack of creativity. It was path dependency. It was a series of U.S. administrations, Democratic and Republican, that saw Israel-Palestine as the most important issue. And they just never got out of their heads to understand that, number one, the Palestinians were not considered as important for most Arabs in the region. Number two, there was a lot of reasons why Israel normalization from a technological perspective, from a trade perspective, from a security perspective was considered useful for a lot of these countries. Number three, Iran was by far the biggest concern, and that was a shared concern for all of these American allies, despite them being on different sides of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And number four, the fact that under Obama-Biden, the United States became the largest energy producer in the world, which means that OPEC in the Middle East didn't have as much influence. So, yes, certainly the fact that Trump's first trip as president was to Riyadh was a big deal and made it easier. But what really made it easier was the fact that no one in the Trump administration thought that Israel-Palestine had to get resolved and you couldn't work on normalization. They didn't even negotiate with the Palestinians as part of the much heralded peace plan that was unveiled. The Palestinians literally weren't part of the conversation. Under Obama and Biden, then Secretary of State Kerry, you may remember, David, spent the first 18 months in power focusing monomaniacally on Israel-Palestine. That was it. I mean, hell, climate's going to be easier for Kerry to do than Israel-Palestine was, right? So I really think this was, if they had been more creative on this issue, these deals were absolutely on the table for the Americans under Obama and Biden. But Trump picked it up.
Fascinating. Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group. Please stay with us. We'll be coming right back to you as we continue to wait for that press briefing. He is the president of Eurasia Group as well as G0 Media. We will get that press briefing sooner or later with Jen Psaki as well as Brian Deese from the White House. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We continue to wait for that press briefing, which is scheduled at the White House. And we are back now with Ian Bremmer. He is president of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. So in the first segment, we went through, Ian, some of the things that actually the Biden administration should continue to do that the Trump administration did. Let's get to the ones where he should change his mind. One of the things that President Trump from the beginning said, I am bilateral, I'm not multilateral. And to a large degree, he followed through on that. He dismantled, a lot of people think, a lot of the architecture internationally. What can President Biden do? What should he do?
Yeah, I mean, he squandered a lot of trust that was already eroding with the United States by withdrawing from a lot of this international architecture that the U.S. actually set up. And, leaving the Paris Climate Accord, which was supported and insupported by literally every other country in the world. I mean, that was an extraordinary mistake. It was done purely to pander for Trump's base at home. It didn't accomplish very much. And Biden, it was a layup for Biden to get back in. Leaving the World Health Organization was an obscenity in the middle of the pandemic. It was meant as part of the anti-China trope. It was a really stupid thing to do. Biden's not only gotten back into it, but also is going to join COVAX in terms of the effort to bring vaccines to the lowest and middle-income countries in the world. That's a smart thing to do. Re-entering arms control talks with the Russians. That's a smart thing to do. I mean, all of getting the judges appointed for the World Trade Organization so it can function more effectively, even though it's a damaged organization. All of the international architecture that the United States has historically driven, even though it's not as effective as it might be, it is better than nothing. And Trump understood that there were problems in that architecture, but he wasn't trying to reform or replace it with anything, as opposed to, say, the USMCA, where recognize their problems with NAFTA, but replace it with something better, that was a win. All of this other stuff was just carnage. That's all it was. It's very easy for Biden to fix it.
Is there realistic opportunity and, for that matter, impetus for reform? As you said, some of those organizations, most people agree, could use some reform. WHO, there's just a new study on WHO. They didn't handle the pandemic all that well. WTO, there's a general consensus. I think there needs to be reform there. Can we still get the reform if we just come back into these organizations?
No. Not generally. I mean, they're sticky, and the people in them, the organizations themselves, resist that kind of thing. I'll give you an example. Look at the Security Council in the United Nations. It's very clear that the two largest democracies in the world that are committed to multilateralism and rule of law are Japan and Germany, and yet neither of them can be permanent members of the Security Council. We would all want them to be. It would make sense. It would make it a stronger organization. You know why they can't join, David? Because they lost World War II. Now, that's a stupid reason, but it is the reality of the institution as we set it up. Having said that, the Paris Climate Accord, we're going to rejoin it, sure, but also we're going to create new, much more robust architecture around climate. And when I see John Kerry and Brian Deese and others in this administration, a new cabinet position, an effort to truly move the United States away from fossil fuels and to try to become dominant in the new technologies of energy, the renewable technologies of energy that the Chinese have big advantages in, that's an area where I think the Biden administration can be quite effective.
Ian, you mentioned START, the START Treaty, and the attempt by President Biden to extend that, as I understand it, for 5 years. What about the relationships with Russia? Because it seems to me that at the same time you want to be nice to the Russians and get them to do the START, at the same time there are a few other issues we have with the Russians, and it can be the Crimea, it can be Nord Stream 2, you name it.
Getting START done doesn't require being nice to the Russians at all. It only requires recognizing a mutuality of interest not to overspend on defense that we don't need, and also trying to reduce the dangers of mutually assured destruction that the nuclear balance as it exists sets up, which is kind of ludicrous, and none of us really want to be in. And you remember that Reagan, sort of actually meeting with Gorbachev, said, if we were both attacked by aliens, wouldn't you come to our defense? And the answer was yes. Well, mutually assured destruction is a bit like that, right? So you don't need to like each other. We don't like each other. This is the worst relationship the U.S. and Russia have had since 1989 when the wall came down. And even though ex-President Trump tried hard to normalize relations with Putin, he was completely incapable of doing so because no one in his cabinet supported that. And so I don't actually think that the Biden administration will reflect that much of a change on Russia policy because Trump wasn't effective at his effort of being more friendly to Putin. Think about the U.S. arms that we sent, like the Javelin missiles, to the Ukrainians. Biden will continue that. That started under Trump. Think about all of the sanctions that we've engaged in against the Russians for their behavior in Crimea and elsewhere. Those will continue. And also, the espionage that the Russians have engaged in, the SolarWinds hack, that is truly, really staggering in terms of its impact. But we've been engaging in espionage against the Russians consistently through Obama, through Trump. We're going to keep doing that. Like, our offensive cyber capabilities are really significant. And I know that as Americans, because we're the most powerful country in the world, we don't like to think that the rules that we apply to other countries also can apply to us. But the fact is that the Russians engage in the same kind of espionage against the U.S. as we engage with them. And there's not much deterrence that's effective on cyber strikes.
Ian, what about Iran and the JCPOA? Because to all appearances, President Biden came in saying, boy, I really want to get that going again. At the same time, has he set the standards, the requirements before the Iranians can come back in so high that as a practical matter, we're not going to see that anytime soon?
The earliest I think you would see the Iranians coming back to an agreement would be the end of 21, beginning of 22, after Iran's own presidential elections, which means from a market perspective, you wouldn't see that additional 1.1 million barrels a day of Iranian crude on the market until early 2022 minimum. But I did see Foreign Minister Javad Zarif already come out with an effort to reach out to the Biden administration and say that they really would like to come back to the old Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA. even referencing the fact that Soleimani was killed under Trump. I mean, not saying bygones be bygones, but basically saying bygones be bygones. That's quite something, right? Having said that, you saw that Avril Haines in her hearings was very clear that it's going to be a lift to get the Iranians back to the table. We're not going to be happy just with the old JCPOA. We also want to talk with them about ballistic missiles, for example. We'll want to have a longer agreement with more teeth in it. That's going to be very hard to do. And so I think we're talking about, we'll start negotiations directly with the Iranians immediately. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if those conversations, those direct bilateral conversations at a working level, have already started. Because, of course, this administration, including people like Wendy Sherwood, were working on the original deal. So the people actually have the connectivity directly, and that helps a lot.
But in fairness, didn't the Obama administration try to deal with some of those other issues, and they just couldn't get there with Iran? Yep. Is there any prospect at all we're going to get to things like ballistic missiles and support of terrorist groups in the area?
I think it's hard. I mean, it's made somewhat easier by the fact that the Iranian economy is in free fall. They really mishandled coronavirus. Energy prices are lower. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Israelis are much closer today than they were before. So Iran is under much more pressure today to work to improve their economy than they were when the Obama-Biden administration put it together. But let's also keep in mind that, Obama and Kerry really wanted to announce that deal. It came under time pressure, and they made it seem like a bigger deal than it actually was. I mean, so many people talk about the pallets of cash that Obama and the U.S. delivered to Iran. Wasn't true. This was Iranian money that was paid before the Iranian Revolution for weapons under the Shah. We never delivered it. We kept their cash illegally. It was their cash that we gave them back. We never opened diplomatic relations with Iran. We maintained sanctions on them. The reason why Obama and Kerry came under such criticism is because they overhyped the deal as bigger than it actually was. So it made it seem like we actually gave a lot up to the Iranians, when in reality, we hadn't. That caused problems in Iran, too. They oversold the deal at home, and that put the reformers the centrists in a lot of trouble when the Iranian economy didn't suddenly pick up and all these companies didn't invest in Iran because it was still really difficult to do.
Basic rule of negotiation: under-promise and over-deliver every time. Ian, it's really great. A treat to talk with you. That's Ian Bremmer. He's president of Eurasia Group and of G0 Media. And now we want to turn to GameStop. Kaylee Alliance is here. And as we've been talking, Kaylee, what is going on? They stopped trading for a while. The volatility is way up. What's going on with GameStop?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, David. So it seems the shares are halted again after rallying 69% very quickly. So it had been halted for volatility. And again, the shares are not trading. This is a stock, David, that is up nearly 300% so far in January. And we are only a couple weeks in. And that had led a short seller, Citron Research, to tweet 2 days ago that it sees the shares returning to $20 quickly. They're around $73 right now. Then what happened next, David, is an army on Reddit, is what it is being described as, went after Citron for that negative commentary. The bullish retail traders coming after the bearish short sellers, eventually leading Citron to say, you know what, fine. They have tweeted they are investors that are putting the safety and family first, and they believe that this has been compromised, so they must walk away from the stock. If that does not speak to the influence of retail investors in this market, David, I am not sure what does. But again, that removal of that short selling commentary from Citron seems to be leading to an incredible rally in GameStop today. Shares are not trading, but at the moment that they were frozen, up 70% just in today's session, David.
Wow, it is a testimony to something, because as you just described, there's no change in the underlying business. It's all about people talking about it. It's got this moving. This is extraordinary, Kaylee. Thank you so much for that report. We're continuing to wait for that press briefing. It is coming, I promise you, and we will bring it to you when it does. That's going to be Press Secretary Jen Psaki, as well as the new National Economic Council Director, Brian Deese. But to get us ready for it, we're going to go back now to Michael McKee. He's Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent. And one of the things we didn't get to talk about earlier, Mike, which I think deserves some attention, is Brian Deese. This will be his premiere in this role. A rather remarkable young man. I believe he's the youngest ever director of the National Economic Council. He's 42 years old, with quite a history already at BlackRock, of course, and then before that in the Obama White House.
Yeah, the Obama White House, he was the deputy director of the National Economic Council, and he spent some time on the National Security Council. He's got quite a resume, and he is described as one of the smartest people who's ever worked at the White House. So he comes in with high expectations, and this is going to be his maiden public voyage in terms of presenting the administration's case. And it is a tough case to make because he's, as we talked about earlier, not just talking to economists who generally agree with the program that the president's putting forward, but to lawmakers who have different political views. I got to say, David, having covered Washington for a long time, it's nice to see that nothing's changed at the White House. I don't think there's a White House that ever runs on time.
That's exactly right.
Doesn't matter the party.
We're going to have Biden time the way we had Clinton time. We don't watch out here in a minute. But it is the case that Brian Deese has some experience sort of related to this because he was very young, but he was an important member of the team that put together the auto bailout. So he was there with Tim Geithner, with Larry Summers, with Barack Obama, and, by the way, Joe Biden in the White House when they were trying to figure out what to do with the auto industry. Yes,
and they put together a very successful program to pull the auto companies through. Not only did they lend the auto companies, not Ford, but the Chrysler and General Motors companies, lend them money to get through, but they made money on the deal when it was over by selling the warrants that they had received. He was also part of the group that put together the American Recovery Act era in 2009, and that also was successful, but not nearly as successful as it could have been. We had a very slow recovery, and that's one of the lessons supposedly he and others in this administration now have learned, that you need to go big, and that'll be one of his selling points. We heard Janet Yellen talk about that the other day. It's better to go big than to not do enough to be able to get the economy to lift off and become self-sustaining, and in this case, to get through the pandemic, to get through to the point where people are enough people are vaccinated that we can get back to a more normal economy.
You got to go big, but you also may negotiate some, because the reports are, as I understand it, Brian Deese is going to be meeting with a bipartisan group of people from Capitol Hill, lawmakers, and they're going to have to do some negotiation. I don't know whether they really believe they're going to get everything they asked for in that $1.9 trillion.
Well, they've been at this for a long time, and they know they're not going to get everything. The question is really more, how do you present this? Do you stick the minimum wage increase into the bill? Probably not if you're trying to do a bipartisan bill, because you'll never get support from Republicans. But maybe if you're doing reconciliation and you're just going to jam it through, you could try that. But even more important, do you risk the good for the best? And in that case, what I'm talking about is they want to get like $400 million for vaccinations. Everybody agrees that's really important. But if you've tied that to aid for state and local communities that the Republicans won't support, then you're going to have a tough time. So do they move separate bills to try to get the most important things through first? And I imagine that getting a read on that will be important for Deese in his meeting this weekend.
Yeah, so important not to let the best be the enemy of the good. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Coming up, we are going to be covering that press briefing at the White House when it occurs. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.